Welcome to Dreadlock Origins. We're going to be talking about Samson from the book of the Bible. So Samson, we're told, is a man in the Bible from the book of Judges that had dreadlocks. And often when we hear about Samson, we hear about the story of Samson and Delilah. But this is only one chapter of a 5-chapter series of stories about Samson, about his dreadlocks, and the impact that they had on his life. Now, there's a number of parallels that we can draw from this story from other cultures around the world. But there's a number of questions that we need to ask. Question 1, are they even dreadlocks? How do we know? How can we be sure that these are dreadlocks? Number 2, what do they mean? What's their purpose? What's the context? And number 3, how does it relate to today? Just to give an idea of where this is, our story begins 3,000 years ago, about 1080 to 1120 BC, so about 1,000 years before Christ, in what is today known as Tel Aviv in Israel. Here's a map of the tribes of Israel, and Samson was a tribal warrior who came from an area called Dan. If we look at our world today and the local map, we can see where it will have been located. Right here by the west bank of Jerusalem on the coastline, we can see what was then known as Dan. So number 1, how can we be sure that they're dreadlocks? So Samson was of a Nazarite people. Now the Nazarite word comes from the Hebrew word Nazir, which literally translates to consecrated or set apart. Part of this Nazarite vow means it prohibits the cutting of the hair to allow the locks to grow. So because this was a Nazarite vow, it would suggest that not only Samson had locks, but the whole Nazarite people. In a recent interview we did with Professor Robert Beckford, the writer of the book Jesus is Dread, he believes that even Jesus had dreadlocks, and this could be predicated on the idea that Jesus was a Nazarite, as he's often referred to as Jesus the Nazarene.
When I was brought up, there were two competing religious forces. One was Christianity, the other was Rastafari. And what I tried to do throughout my whole of my life, particularly my academic career, was bridge the two. And I created this discipline called Dread Theology, combining aspects of Rastafari with Pentecostalism.
But we'll save that for another video. This Nazarite vow can be found in the book of Numbers, chapter 6, verse 5. Now there's obviously a lot of different translations of the Bible out there, but you can cross-reference them on BibleGateway.com to get the widest context. But the most common translation we've seen can also be found in the King James Version that says this: all the days of the vow of his separation, no razor shall come upon his head, until the days are fulfilled for which he separated himself to the Lord. He shall be holy. Then he shall let the locks of his hair of his head grow. So the term locks of his hair comes from the Hebrew word pera, which can also be treated as left alone or just left to its own devices, much like we would consider freeform dreadlocks. The word signifies uncut, the dishevelled look of the Nazarite or even of the priests. This same word pera is also used in Ezekiel 44:20. So by using the original Hebrew word, the description, the context of that particular word, we can say with certainty that these were freeform dreadlocks that we might see today. So question number 2, why dreadlocks? Who is Samson and what's the context? So as we know, the story of Samson comes from the Bible, but to set some context, we need to understand what this book really is. Now, some people consider the Bible as a single book, when in actual fact it's a library of books and all are to be read in very different ways. An example of this is the Book of Songs. It's a poetic enactment of somebody's love. So in this case, it's not to be taken literally. Other books like Numbers often have chapter upon chapter of genealogical records. There's also some books that are written as parables, so not to be taken literally as well. However, the book of Judges is a record of history. This book follows the story of Joshua. So at this time, Joshua was leading the people in covenant, in relationship with God. These people also lived around foreign tribes who had their own customs, their own ways, which the Bible describes as immoral, so far as to going into child sacrifice. When Joshua died, the people come away from God's way and started to do what was right in their own eyes, so far as to consider child sacrifice themselves. As the book of Judges goes on, these characters get worse and worse as they get further and further away from God. In comes Samson. But why is it called Judges? So as they fell away from God, these different tribes of Israel were essentially warrior tribes. And in each of these tribes, a particular warrior rose up as the strongest, the dominant member of that tribe, one of which was Samson. So not only is Samson a Nazarite, but he's also a warrior. These two things parallel with a number of other cultures. So in terms of the Nazarite vow 12 uncut and dishevelled, this would be the same practice as in India with the sadhus as they go out for 30 years, leave culture behind, the hair becomes dishevelled and dreadlocks form, or as the Indians call them, jata. As for the warrior aspects, this can also be found in Peruvian culture. As the warriors develop in the tribes, the dreadlocks were seen as a sense of status. However, in this story of Samson, there's something significant going on. So in Judges 13, we see that as Samson is introduced, an angel of the Lord appears and speaks to his mum. And in verse 6 to 7 says this. She says, "A man from God came to me. He looked like an angel of God, very awesome. I didn't ask him where he came from, and he didn't tell me his name. But he said to me, 'You will become pregnant and have a son. Now then, drink no wine and no other fermented drink, and do not eat anything unclean, because the boy will be a Nazarite of God from the womb until the day of his death.'" So even before Samson's born, he's committed to God, he's committed to becoming a Nazarite, as is the way of his mum and dad. And in verse 24 it says, "The woman gave birth to a boy and named him Samson. He grew and the Lord blessed him, and the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him." So right at the beginning here, we've got this story of a baby being born into a covenant, into a relationship with God, is essentially what covenant means, a relationship, taking on these Nazarite vows, and part of that commitment, that identity, are these dreadlocks. However, at this point, this is his parents' commitment of him to God, and not his own choices. As the story goes on, we see him make his own choices, we see how that shapes his life, and at which point the dreadlocks come into play. But also remember, in the wider context, this isn't just his parents. The wider context is the whole people group has fallen away from this covenant with God. But even though the people have fallen away from God, God's plan breaks through and even uses people that are against him. As we look at verse 13, we see that Samson marries someone who wasn't intended for him. So the hope was that Samson would marry within his own people and keep the customs, the covenant that they had with God, doing what was right in his own eyes. He goes his own way. But despite that, God is still at work. This woman ultimately sleeps with someone else and he gets angry. Now, Samson isn't having much luck with women, but it's about to get a lot worse. He's about to meet Delilah. But before he meets her, something very significant happens. In his fit of revenge, killing 1,000 men, he's lying there thirsty, dying of starvation and thirst in the desert. This is the first time he cries out to God and he says, "God, help me. Come in and provide what I need." And God honours that, gives him water and brings him back to life. Judges 15 verse 18 to 19. "Because he was very thirsty, he cried out to the Lord, 'You have given your servant this great victory. Must I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised?' Then God opened up the hollow place and water came out of it. When Samson drank, his strength returned and he revived." So right here we're seeing that despite his bad choices, the moment that he came to God, God says, "Here you go." He gives him what he needs. So despite Samson's terrible decisions, the moment that he cries out to God, God's there to meet him, provides for him, and commits to that covenant that he has. And this will be very important when we come to his dreadlocks in a moment. And Samson hasn't finished making some stupid decisions. Judges 16, Samson and Delilah. After sleeping with a hooker, smashing up the brothel, he then meets Delilah and falls in love with her. The Philistines see this and decide to bribe her with money to try and get to Samson. And to do this, they offer her a ton of cash. She takes the bribe, and as the story goes on, she's trying to get this information out of Samson. On a few occasions, he denies her and finally gives in and tells her the secret to his power. Verse 17. "No razor has ever been on my head," he said, "because I have been a Nazarite dedicated to God from my mother's womb. If my head were shaved, my strength would leave me and I would become as weak as any other man." Then verse 19 specifically says 7 locks of hair. So after he gives away his secret, he has his locks cut off, and the rest of the chapter is him being enslaved, beaten, his eyes gouged out. It's pretty bad. Like when Samson was in the desert, he has one last ditch attempt and cries out to God, "God, come to me." Verse 28, "Then Samson prayed to the Lord, 'Sovereign Lord, remember me. Please God, strengthen me just once more, and let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes.' Then Samson reached towards the centre pillars of which the temple stood, bracing himself against them, his right hand on one and his left hand on the other. Samson said, 'Let me die with the Philistines.' Then he pushed with all his might, and down came the temple on the rulers and all the people in it. So what the dreadlocks here are symbolising is not specifically that dreadlocks contain power within them. They're simply a symbol of the covenant between the Nazarite people and with God. Now, it's not known who wrote the book of Judges, but Jewish leaders tend to point to the prophet Samuel. The earliest surviving record of the Hebrew scriptures is held in Jerusalem, and it's known as the Aleppo Codex. There was over 5,800 original manuscripts of the Bible found, making it one of the most credible historical stories we have. Now, I don't want to go full out into credibilities, but there's a series on YouTube called the Alpha Course if you wanted to check that out. I just want to close with two more links. Number one is the 2013 mini-series called the Bible Series, where you can check out the story of Samson. And number two is the theatrical trailer 2018 called Samson. I hope you enjoyed this video, and all the links are below. Check out the Dreads UK YouTube channel for more original stories, tutorial videos about dreadlocks, and our monthly e-zine.
My name is Samson, and you will face the wrath of God.